Supplementary contributory pension schemes of a national Social Security pension system differ in many aspects, and they have different financial, economic, and social implications. We are now going to see three important dimensions of these schemes, namely benefit design, funding approach, and administration.
In terms of benefit design, there are two schemes to choose from: defined benefit and defined contribution. The choice between these two schemes will have implications on both the funding approach and administration. But before we get into that, let's focus on the different ways the two schemes work. On the face of it, defined benefit and defined contribution schemes look very similar. In both cases, people pay contributions during their working lives and receive pension benefits once they retire. But the two schemes differ in the way contribution levels and benefits are determined. The choice between the two types of pension schemes will affect the national economy and social outcomes. It is not a coincidence, then, that the debate over which scheme is best has been going on for so long, and that it is far from over. Let's look at the main differences between the two. When somebody is working, their employer typically has to enroll them into a Social Security pension scheme, which, by law, must collect contributions throughout their career. Those contributions are split between employers and employees and are sometimes also topped up by the government. If it's a defined benefit scheme, the contributions paid on behalf of all workers go into a common pool. The institution that administers a DB scheme is public and must keep a record of how many years workers contribute and how much they've earned during their working lives. Contributions paid into a DB scheme cover the benefits of those who contributed in the past but are now retired, as well as the scheme's administrative costs. What's left over makes up the reserve, the assets of the scheme, which are invested to generate returns. So this reserve tends to increase over time, and if contributions should, at some point, fail to cover pension benefits, the reserve covers the shortfall. If it's a defined contribution scheme, all the contributions paid into a participant's individual account make up the reserve. Indeed, under this scheme, contributions go into a worker's individual account, not a common pool. Savings are invested and returns accrue to that account. Private pension administrators, among whom participants in a DC scheme typically have to choose from, don't manage this whole system for free, of course. They charge commissions over the contributions, returns, and/or savings. The size of the commission is regulated by supervisory bodies. The operation of DB schemes isn't free either. The public institutions that keep the common pool of reserves, collect and register contributions, and pay benefits require an institutional setup with civil servants whose salaries must come out of the contributions. The debate on whether it is more efficient to finance one single institution or the commissions of multiple private pension operators is just one side of the debate in the DC-DB discussion. So, in sum, in DB schemes, contributions go into a common fund that is used to pay for benefits and administration. What's left goes into reserves used for investments. In DC schemes, contributions go into participants' individual accounts. These are invested and generate returns, which, in part, pay for private firms' administrative fees. When workers reach retirement and minimum contribution requirements are met, the way their pensions are calculated varies under a DB or DC scheme. In a DB scheme, the pension is determined by a formula which depends on years of contribution and past earnings. The formula is prescribed by law and gives pensioners a clear figure depending on the number of years they have contributed and how much they have earned. The value of pensions is then guaranteed. Not so in DC schemes, which are somewhat riskier. With these schemes, pension benefits come in the form of annuities, which provide a guaranteed regular income lasting the rest of a pensioner's life. Annuities are normally purchased from an insurance company using the accumulated savings of a member's individual account. But as these savings are typically invested in financial markets, and as the cost of annuities are linked to interest rates, it is hard for members to know how much they will earn at retirement before they get there. Another major difference between DC and DB schemes is that pensions paid out under DC schemes may not be adjusted to inflation. That's mainly because inflation-adjusted annuities are costly. Those who wish protection against price inflation must be prepared to accept lower benefits. Most DB schemes, on the other hand, have indexation rules that protect the purchasing power of benefits. Summing up once more then, in DC schemes, pension benefits are annuities purchased with the contributions that were kept in individual accounts, invested to generate returns while paying for administrative fees. In DB schemes, pension benefits are calculated according to a statutory formula and paid out of a common pool made of contributions and returns on investments, of which a small amount is used for administrative expenses. DB schemes work on the principle that new generations will join and contribute. So, transferring some resources from this new generation to older ones reduces the need to allocate resources for retirement, as the current contributors will receive financing from the future contributors. DC schemes don't use this generational transfer, making each generation responsible for financing its own retirement.
Under a DC scheme, workers have to bear the majority of risks. For example, investment risk, the risk of loss in asset values due to adverse market conditions resulting in lower pensions. Inflation risk, the risk that the real purchasing power of the pension will be eroded due to higher inflation. Interest rate risk, the risk of reduction in market interest rates at the time of retirement, which makes the purchase of an annuity more expensive, thus resulting in a lower pension. And finally, longevity risk, the risk of a bigger increase in life expectancies at retirement, which will result in a lower pension. Under a DB scheme, most of these risks are not borne by the individual workers, but collectively borne by all stakeholders, namely workers, employers, and the government. However, this situation needs to be gradually reformed so that future financial sustainability can be maintained. Some of the reforms, such as an increase in the retirement age, are not necessarily popular by stakeholders, and there is a political risk that reforms may not be implemented in a timely fashion. A better designed scheme with periodical financial inadequacy assessments and consultations among stakeholders will reduce future political risks in the ever-changing demographic, social, and economic environment.
Since its foundation, the International Labour Organization has been promoting pension systems based on what are called defined benefit or DB schemes. These are based on solidarity, collective funding, and public management. The reason for such a preference is simple. DB schemes are the only ones to comply with the ILO core principles stated in the organization's constitution and various social security standards. These include non-discrimination, which is reflected in the solidarity and universal coverage guaranteed by law in DB schemes. When they are well designed, these schemes ensure fair pensions for both rich and poor. Because a pension formula is used, people with lower incomes and shorter or interrupted careers will get bigger pensions in proportion to their contributions compared to people who had higher salaries and longer uninterrupted careers. The DB pension formula modifies the amount of pension each dollar of contribution is buying to improve resource distribution and avoid economic insecurity. That's what we call solidarity. The main type of scheme that is not fully consistent with ILO principles is called defined contribution. In DC schemes, the amount of pension benefits contributions buy is determined by an individual's saving effort and by the market without social considerations. Solidarity is not possible between individuals. In these schemes, people who received low salaries with long periods of unemployment will have few accumulated savings at the time of retirement. No mechanism exists to ensure they get an adequate pension to live in dignity. When they retire, they cannot keep the quality of life they enjoyed before, and so often they just cannot stop working. When a minimum benefit does exist, then it has to come out of the state budget via taxes. The main problem with DC schemes is that they replicate labor market and gender inequalities, as final benefits are directly associated to the performance of financial markets. Systemic financial risks are transferred from society as a whole to individuals. DC schemes do not attempt to be universal. They cannot, therefore, really be classified as social security mechanisms. The previously explained DB schemes, on the other hand, are based on solidarity, extending protection to everyone in society. At this point, you're probably thinking that DB schemes sound a little too good to be true. There must be a catch, right? How exactly do they manage to ensure solidarity? Well, DB schemes are the responsibility of the state, including financing when resources from contributions fail to cover all the costs of benefits. Income from taxes are critical to ensure solidarity and financial sustainability. That's why, among other reasons, the state is interested in financial sustainability. Financially solid schemes will require less tax funding and so free up money for other uses. DB schemes usually include dialogue among social partners, as workers and employers associations try their best to keep these schemes financially sound while defending the interests of their members. Workers and employers also have a vested interest in a scheme that works well because they expect to receive benefits at retirement. A well-protected aged population contributes to demand for local production. And finally, because financially sound pension schemes allow tax money to be invested in other social projects, including infrastructure or measures that boost competitiveness. This is called tripartite constituent participation, the interaction of workers and employers' representatives in the governance of social protection schemes. This helps improve transparency, and through social dialogue, it ensures that the design of DB schemes maximizes the positive impacts of solidarity, adequacy, and universality. All this is fundamental to Social Security pension scheme design and operation. ILO international standards encourage this kind of social dialogue as an essential part of governance. In comparison, DC schemes are usually managed by private firms, so social partners' participation in their administration and supervision is limited to non-existent. DC schemes are normally supervised by the same bodies that supervise financial institutions, and here social partners are also excluded. While a certain level of transparency can be expected in the financial reporting to supervisory bodies, this does not extend to all stakeholders. Some decades ago, a wave of structural reform replaced public and solitary DB schemes with private DC schemes in many parts of the world. The ILO stayed loyal to its vision that only DB schemes were aligned with ILO principles and pointed out the risks of privatizing pension systems. Most pro-privatization pension reforms were guided by fiscal agendas, promising to cut pension deficits and taxes, all the while improving pension benefits and coverage. The logic behind this shift was based on what we can call the neoclassical economic model, which in turn is based on quite unrealistic assumptions. The main one being that individuals and fund managers are guided by market forces, thus guaranteeing more efficient results. For example, if people know they own the pension fund, then this encourages others to sign up and so boosts overall coverage. But in real life, things work the other way around. In countries that switched, private DC schemes turned out to be a big letdown. Here's why. First, in each case, the rejected DB schemes needed to keep paying the benefits of those already retired. So at least a part of the former DB schemes had to continue functioning. As this part could not be financed by contributions anymore, the state had little choice but to pick up the tab. And yet the ILO had alerted countries to this impending problem. And secondly, most people don't understand much about the way the market works. So their behavior was driven by many factors other than best prices, fund profitability, or lower administrative costs. Administrative costs of private schemes went through the roof for two reasons. First, fund administrators used up lots of resources in marketing to convince participants to switch over to them. Secondly, those that were most successful pushed out the competition, leaving them in a position to charge higher commissions, which of course were coming out of contributions. All this often resulted in low and stagnant coverage. Pension systems alone cannot solve labor market problems, and formalization of labor requires a different set of policies. The great costs of switching from one scheme to another were, in most cases, borne by the most vulnerable in society. Most beneficiaries ended up frustrated and disappointed, to the point that many countries have decided to go back to DB schemes, while many more are currently considering it. These experiences have certainly shown that ILO's long-lasting support of DB schemes was correct.
Cost development of a contributory pension scheme. Before talking about the funding approach of a pension scheme, we need to know about the expected financial evolution of pension scheme expenditures. It is essential that a pension scheme should annually secure cash flow to meet its yearly expenditures. The necessary cash flow is financed by contributions, investment returns on assets, and liquidation of assets if needed. The annual cost of a DB or DC scheme is expressed as the percentage of total annual insurable earnings of all contributors, and this rate is called the pay-as-you-go cost rate.
The typical development of the pay-as-you-go cost rate is shown in the following figure. When the scheme starts, there are no old age pensioners, and there are small numbers of invalid and survivor pensioners with low benefits. The number of pensioners increases faster than the number of contributors, as many pensioners continue to receive pensions for decades, and as the average benefit increases in line with longer periods of contribution. The gradual and steady increase of the pay-as-you-go cost rate continues for decades and stabilizes when the ratio of pensioners to contributors becomes stable. Given the evolution of pension expenditures, how can those expenditures be financed? If a scheme asks its members to contribute exactly the same amount as the pensions paid out, it is what we call a pay-as-you-go scheme. Pay-as-you-go financing of pensions is inconvenient because nobody knows the contribution rates in advance. What we can be quite sure of is that they will grow because initially, of course, the number of beneficiaries is small. But as the scheme gathers steam, more and more people sign up, and as they retire, they generate increasing demand on the contributors who must pay for their pensions. Partial funding exists to help solve this injustice. Contribution rates can be set at a level that allows payment of benefits, while at the same time allowing some money to go into reserves. As these can later be used to pay for benefits, the contribution rate can be fixed for relatively long periods of time. Partial funding is the most common way to bankroll defined benefit schemes. In the case of a defined contribution scheme, the benefit is the annuity contract that can be purchased with the individual account at the time of retirement. At all times, the value of the past contributions in the individual account equals the market value of the future benefits. We say that the future benefits are fully funded, as they do not depend at all on future contributions to be paid.
A selection of a funding method for a social insurance contributory pension scheme is based on such factors as contributing capacities and investment opportunities, as well as demography. As contributing capacities and investment opportunities increase in line with the national economic and social development, many contributory schemes have started with lower contribution rates and gradually increased these rates. Administration. The administration of Social Security contributory pension schemes can be public, that is, run by the state, or a public social insurance agency, or private, run by private financial institutions, regulated by the government. Most Social Security contributory pension schemes use public administration. A number of countries, primarily in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, reformed their defined benefit Social Security contributory pension schemes to defined contribution schemes run by private financial institutions. This was done partially based on arguments that private institutions would achieve higher investment returns on assets and more efficient administration through private competition. More choice would be provided to individuals, and that renewed trust in the new system would increase participation and contributions to the system. Contrary to expectations, investment returns did not increase as expected, and the fundamental instability of relying on investment returns became apparent, especially in the recent financial crisis. High operating costs, such as sales and marketing, as well as transaction costs, especially in cases of switching from one fund to another, have been frequently observed in these countries. The coverage has deteriorated under many of these new arrangements due to a lack of proper information and high transaction costs for switching financial institutions. Switching of private providers by contributors has not been exercised or has led to substantial costs for contributors where switches have taken place.